Among the countless stories of the American Civil War, there's one that sounds almost fantastical, a legend about glowing wounds that saved soldiers' lives. This phenomenon earned the poetic name Angel's Glow. For over a century and a half, this story remained a mystery, balancing between myth and reality, until early in the 21st century when science offered its explanation. On April 6 to 7, 1862, in western Tennessee, one of the bloodiest battles of the war's early phase unfolded, the Battle of Shiloh. This clash between Union, Northern, and Confederate, Southern, forces became a turning point in understanding the true cost of war. The battle statistics are horrifying even a century and a half later. Approximately 3,000 soldiers died in combat. More than 16,000 men were wounded to varying degrees. Many of the wounded remained on the battlefield without medical care for up to 48 hours. Nature seemed to conspire to worsen the already catastrophic situation for the wounded soldiers. The battle took place under extremely unfavorable conditions. April rains turned the battlefield into a veritable swamp. Cold spring weather in Tennessee meant that air and soil temperatures dropped significantly below comfortable levels, especially at night. Military medicine in the 1860s was primitive by modern standards. The absence of antibiotics, limited understanding of antiseptics, and the overwhelming number of casualties created perfect conditions for mass infections. The wounded lay on cold, soaked ground, their wounds quickly becoming contaminated and beginning to fester. Gangrene, sepsis, and other infectious complications killed more soldiers than the wounds themselves. Doctors of the era were virtually powerless against developing infections. Amputation was often the only way to save a life. It was under these hellish conditions that something unusual occurred. Soldiers lying in the darkness on the battlefield began noticing a strange phenomenon. Their wounds glowed faintly in the dark with an eerie blue-green light. The glow was barely visible, but in the pitch darkness of the night battlefield, it was impossible to miss. At first, it seemed like a hallucination brought on by pain, shock, and blood loss. However, too many soldiers reported the same phenomenon for it to be dismissed as mass delusion. But the most surprising discovery lay ahead. When the wounded were finally evacuated from the battlefield and army doctors began examining them, a striking pattern emerged. Soldiers whose wounds glowed survived more often than others. Their wounds healed faster and with fewer complications. They less frequently developed gangrene, the leading cause of death and amputations. The overall level of infectious complications was substantially lower. In an era when science couldn't yet explain many natural phenomena, and religiosity was an integral part of life, soldiers and medics found their own explanation. They decided they had witnessed divine intervention. Angels descended onto the battlefield and marked with their glow those destined to survive. Thus was born the name Angel's Glow. The story quickly spread among the troops, becoming one of the Civil War's most mystical legends, a symbol of hope in an ocean of death and suffering. It seemed this story would remain a beautiful legend, one of many myths spawned by war. But in 2001, two American high school students decided to apply a scientific approach to the old tale. Bill Martin and John Curtis, high schoolers, became intrigued by the Angel's Glow legend for their project at the prestigious Intel ISEF, International Science and Engineering Fair. They weren't satisfied with the mystical explanation, they wanted to find a rational, scientific basis for the phenomenon. After studying historical sources and modern microbiological data, the students proposed a bold hypothesis. They suggested that the glow was caused by the bioluminescent bacterium Photorhabdus luminescens, a microorganism capable of producing its own light through chemical reactions. This bacterium was well known to biologists, but in a completely different context. It lives in the intestines of nematodes, microscopic parasitic worms that inhabit soil. In nature, this symbiotic pair functions as an effective biological insect killer. Martin and Curtis developed a detailed explanation of how the bacterium could have saved soldiers' lives. Wounded soldiers lay directly on wet soil. Nematodes living in the ground could enter open wounds along with dirt and soil particles. Along with the worms came the bacterium Photorhabdus luminescens. Under normal conditions, the human body with a temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit creates a lethal environment for this bacterium. However, cold April nights in Tennessee, soaked clothing, and prolonged lying on cold ground lowered the wounded soldiers' body temperatures. This created ideal conditions for Photorhabdus luminescens to survive and multiply. The bacteria began to glow. This is their natural property, related to special chemical reactions, luminescence, in their cells. This glow was exactly what the soldiers saw in the darkness. Most importantly, Photorhabdus luminescens produces powerful natural antibiotics, bacteriocins, and toxins. In the wounds, these substances began destroying other bacteria dangerous to humans, the causative agents of gangrene, sepsis, and other infections. Essentially, the bacterium cleared out the wound of competitors, incidentally saving the soldier's life. As the wounded were evacuated and their body temperature returned to normal, Photorhabdus luminescens naturally died off or were removed from the body, leaving behind a wound cleared of infection. The students' project caused a sensation. They not only won first place at Intel ISEF but also attracted the attention of the professional scientific community. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and leading microbiologists became interested in the hypothesis. Subsequent research confirmed the feasibility of the proposed mechanism. The biology of Photorhabdus luminescens was well studied in the context of crop protection. It's used for biological pest control, and its antibacterial properties were documented. Martin and Curtis's hypothesis gained widespread popularity and support. All biological mechanisms described in the hypothesis are real and documented. Photorhabdus luminescens really does glow, really does produce antibiotics, and really does inhabit soil. Prestigious science publications, including Smithsonian and National Geographic, published materials about angels' glow, lending the story additional legitimacy. Other cases of bioluminescent infections are known in history, though they're rare. This phenomenon isn't unique to Shiloh. All conditions of the battle, cold, moisture, soil, prolonged wait for help, perfectly match the hypothesis's requirements. However, not everyone agrees with the romantic version of the story. Historians specializing in the Civil War, including rangers at Shiloh National Military Park, conducted a thorough analysis of more than 2,000 contemporary documents, soldiers' diaries, letters home, medical reports, newspaper publications. The result was surprising, not a single mention of glowing wounds. The first public mentions of angels' glow date to precisely 2001, the time of the students' project presentation. This suggests the legend may have been retroactively created or significantly embellished in the 21st century. Shiloh is often called the Western Gettysburg, a battle of enormous symbolic significance. Such historical sites often accumulate beautiful legends that make history more romantic and memorable. The well-known fact-checking site Snopes classifies the Angel's Glow story as unverified, neither calling it completely fabricated nor recognizing it as proven. The Angel's Glow story remains a fascinating example of how science and folklore can intertwine in the most unexpected ways. Regardless of whether Shiloh soldiers actually saw glowing wounds, or whether this is beautiful modern mythology, the story itself is valuable for several reasons. The story introduced millions of people to the real phenomenon of bioluminescence and demonstrated how natural symbioses, nematodes and bacteria, can have unexpected consequences for humans. Martin and Curtis's project shows how ancient mysteries can be reconsidered using modern scientific knowledge. Their story has inspired many students to pursue research projects. Angel's Glow reminds us that nature is full of unexpected solutions. What seemed like a divine miracle to 19th century soldiers turned out to be an elegant biological mechanism, and there's a special beauty in that. The discussion around the phenomenon's reality teaches an important lesson. Even beautiful and scientifically grounded stories require verification with primary sources. Science isn't just about proposing hypotheses, but also about carefully testing them. Research on Photorhabdus luminescens continues today. Scientists are studying its antibacterial compounds in hopes of creating new antibiotics, a particularly urgent task in an era of growing antibiotic resistance. So regardless of historical accuracy, the Angel's Glow legend continues to save lives, just now in 21st century laboratories rather than on the battlefields of the war between North and South. The angel's glow story is a reminder that sometimes the most incredible stories turn out to be true, and sometimes the most plausible explanations remain merely beautiful hypotheses. And in this uncertainty lies the special charm of historical mysteries. Subscribe to the channel and leave your feedback.